The chrome of 20 Harley-Davidsons gleamed like a threat in the blistering California sun. Inside the roadside diner, the air was thick with the smell of grease and danger. No one dared breathe when two starving, filthy children walked up to the terrifying president of the Hells Angels and whispered, "Sir, could we have your leftovers? Cash." The Crossroads Diner sat just off Interstate 15, a decaying monument to the golden age of route travel, surrounded by miles of unforgiving Mojave desert. On a typical Tuesday, it hosted tired truckers and lost tourists. But today, the parking lot was dominated by a perfectly aligned row of heavy American iron. The Hells Angels had arrived. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The regular patrons kept their eyes glued to their lukewarm coffees, terrified that a stray glance might be misconstrued as a challenge. The bikers occupied the entire back section of the diner, a sea of black leather, heavy denim, and the iconic death's head patches that commanded a universal, visceral respect. They were loud, their laughter rumbling like thunder over the clattering of silverware. At the head of the largest table sat James Big Jim Callahan. Jim was a mountain of a man, his arms covered in a chaotic tapestry of faded ink, his beard thick and threaded with silver. He was the president of the San Bernardino Charter, a man whose reputation was built on decades of ruthless loyalty and uncompromising power. Right now, however, Jim was just a man irritated by an overcooked T-bone steak. He pushed his plate away, a substantial portion of meat and fries left untouched, and signaled to the trembling waitress Brenda for more black coffee. Outside the diner, crouched behind the rusted bulk of an overflowing dumpster, 10-year-old Toby watched the scene through the grease-stained window. His throat was a desert, his stomach a hollow, agonizing void. Beside him, clinging to his torn t-shirt, was his 5-year-old sister, Lily. Lily hadn't spoken in 3 days, not since their mother had told them to wait in the motel room, locked the door from the outside, and never came back. Toby had managed to pry the bathroom window open after 2 days of waiting. They had walked for miles under the scorching sun until the neon sign of the Crossroads Diner flickered like a mirage. "I'm hungry, Tobes," Lily whimpered, her voice barely a dry rasp. Her face was streaked with dirt and dried tears, her small lips cracked and bleeding. Toby looked through the glass. He saw the terrifying men in leather. He saw the terrified customers. More importantly, he saw the massive, half-eaten steak sitting unguarded on Jim Callahan's plate. To a starving boy, fear is a luxury he can no longer afford. "Stay behind me," Toby whispered, taking his sister's frail hand. The bell above the diner door jingled violently as Toby pushed it open. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. Brenda, balancing a pot of boiling coffee, froze. 2 businessmen in the corner stopped chewing. Toby ignored them. He was a boy on a mission, fueled by the primal instinct to keep his sister alive. He wore an oversized, filthy denim vest that hung down to his knees, swallowing his emaciated frame. His sneakers were held together by duct tape. He walked straight down the center aisle, pulling a trembling Lily behind him, heading directly for the epicenter of danger, the Hells Angels table. Silas Wrench Montgomery, a heavily scarred biker sitting to Jim's right, was the first to notice. He stopped mid-scent, his hand dropping to the heavy hunting knife strapped to his belt out of pure reflex, before realizing the threat was knee-high. "Well, look at what the cat dragged in," Wrench muttered, his deep voice carrying through the sudden silence of the diner. The entire table of bikers fell dead silent. 20 pairs of hardened, unforgiving eyes turned to lock onto the 2 tiny figures. The air in the diner grew so thick you could cut it with a chainsaw. Brenda gasped and took a step forward, intending to intercept the children before they angered the club. But a sharp, raised hand from Jim stopped her dead in her tracks. Toby stopped inches from Jim's table. He was shaking so hard his teeth chattered, despite the suffocating heat of the diner. He looked up at Jim. To Toby, the biker looked like a giant from a nightmare leather-clad titan with cold, calculating blue eyes that seemed to look right through him. Toby swallowed hard, trying to find moisture that wasn't there. He pointed a trembling, dirt-caked finger at the plate of abandoned food. "Sir." Toby's voice broke. He cleared his throat, tightening his grip on Lily's hand. "Sir, could we have your leftovers? We wouldn't bother you, but my sister, she's real hungry." The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. The ceiling fan clicked rhythmically above them. A trucker in the corner muttered a quick prayer under his breath, expecting the notorious biker to explode in a violent rage at the sheer audacity of the filthy street rat interrupting his meal. Jim didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his massive hands resting on the edge of the table, his eyes locked onto Toby's face. For a terrifying 30 seconds, Jim Callahan simply stared. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely unreadable, which, to anyone who knew the Hells Angels, was far more dangerous. "You got some nerve, kid," Wrench growled from the side, leaning forward. "You know whose table you just walked up to." "Let him speak," Wrench Jim commanded. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the chests of everyone nearby. Wrench instantly leaned back, crossing his massive arms. Jim shifted his gaze from Toby's terrified eyes to the little girl hiding behind his leg. He saw the way her collarbone protruded, the dark, bruised bags under her eyes, the desperate way she chewed on her bottom lip. Then his eyes drifted back to Toby. Specifically, his eyes locked onto the oversized, filthy denim vest Toby was wearing. Jim's breathing hitched. It was a microscopic movement, but to his brothers around the table, it was as loud as a gunshot. Jim leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking in protest. His cold blue eyes suddenly whitened in a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Step closer, boy," Jim said, his voice strangely tight. Toby took a hesitant step forward, pulling Lily with him. Jim reached out a massive, calloused step forward, pulling Lily with him. Jim reached out a massive, calloused hand. Toby flinched till he grasped the Lepeda's oversized biddist. It wasn't just a generic piece of clothing. Hidden beneath a layer of desert dust and grime, there was a crude, hand-drawn symbol in faded black permanent marker on the inner lining of the collar. It was a winged skull, heavily distorted with the number 81 scribbled beneath it. But it was the writing below the skull that drained the blood from Jim Callahan's face. Property of TC Ride Hard, Die Free Tums. Face property of Titosh. Might Hard, Die Free Sand began to tremble. This wasn't just a vest. This was cut biker's sacred vest. And not just any cut. It was a prospect vest that had belonged to a young man who had vanished without a trace 6 years ago in the Badlands of Nevada. "Where did you get this?" Jim asked. His voice was no longer a rumble of authority. It was a fractured, desperate whisper. Toby opened his eyes, surprised by the lack of pain. He looked at the giant man, confused by the sudden vulnerability in his terrifying face. "It was my dad's," Toby whispered defensively. "He told me to wear it if I needed to be brave." He said the men who wore these letters were the toughest in the world. Wrench stood up so fast his chair crashed to the linoleum floor. The rest of the Hells Angels at the table shifted, the tension instantly pivoting from irritation to absolute electric shock. "What's your name, kid?" Jim asked, ignoring the chaos erupting around him. He dropped to one knee, putting himself at eye level with the starving boy. "Toby. Toby. What?" Jim pressed, his hands gripping the boy's small shoulders. "What is your last name, son?" Toby looked at the terrifying men, then back to Jim. "Callahan. Toby Callahan. And this is Lily." A collective gasp echoed through the diner, not from the patrons, but from the Hells Angels. Wrench took off his sunglasses, wiping a hand across his scarred face. "Christ almighty, Jim," Wrench breathed. "Tommy's kids. He actually had kids." Thomas Callahan was Jim's brother. Tommy had been a wild card, a prospect for the club who fell in with a bad crowd pushing methamphetamine across the state line. He had gotten in deep with a rival cartel and vanished one night, leaving behind nothing but rumors of a shallow grave in the desert. The club had searched for months, leaving a trail of broken teeth and burned-out buildings in their wake. But they never found him. Jim had carried the weight of his brother's disappearance every day since. He never knew Tommy had a family. Jim Callahan, a man who had survived prison riots, shootouts, and decades of brutal gang warfare, felt a hot tear track down his weathered cheek. He pulled Toby and Lily against his chest, burying his face in their filthy hair. The giant biker shook with silent sobs. Toby froze, entirely bewildered. The scariest man in the world was crying while holding him. Jim pulled back, his eyes suddenly burning with a terrifying protective fire. He stood up, towering over the diner. He looked at Wrench, then around the table at his brothers. No words were needed. The shift in the room was palpable. These children were no longer street rats, they were club blood. These children were no longer street rats. They were club blood. Jim turned his massive head toward the kitchen. "Brenda!" he roared. The waitress jumped nearly a foot in the air. "Yes, Mr. Callahan. I want 6 orders of pancakes. I want bacon, eggs, hash browns, and every carton of milk you have in that goddamn fridge. Bring it to the biggest booth you got. Now." "Yes, sir. Right away." Brenda scrambled toward the kitchen, screaming orders at the cook. Jim looked down at Toby, gently brushing a smudge of dirt off the boy's cheek. "You don't eat leftovers anymore, Toby. Not ever again." The bikers immediately sprang into action. Without being told, Arthur Meat Sullivan, a guy the size of a refrigerator, gently picked Lily, sprang into action. Without being told, Arthur Meat it would spun glass. Wrench guided Toby to the largest booth in the corner. The remaining 18 bikers didn't sit down. Instead, they formed a human barricade around the booth, turning their backs to the children and facing the diner, arms crossed, eyes scanning the windows and the terrified patrons. They had formed a fortress of leather and muscle. As Toby and Lily devoured the food that arrived in mountains, Jim sat across from them, drinking his coffee, his eyes never leaving their faces. He watched Toby cut Lily's pancakes, making sure she ate before he took a bite for himself. It was a heartbreaking echo of how Jim used to look after Tommy when they were kids. Once the initial desperation of their hunger subsided, Toby slowed down, looking up at Jim through his overgrown bangs. "Are you going to take us to the police?" Toby asked, his voice trembling again. "Mom said if the cops get us, they'll put us in a cage." Jim's jaw tightened. "No cops, Toby. You're safe now. But I need you to be a brave man and tell me everything. Where is your mother?" Toby looked down at his empty plate. "She left us at the Starlight Motel 2 days ago. She said she owed money to some bad men who sell the sleepy dust. She said they were coming for her, and she had to run to keep us safe." Toby swallowed hard. "But yesterday, the men came to the motel. They were banging on the door, looking for her. They had guns, Mr. Jim. They said if they found us, they'd use us to make her pay." The air around the booth seemed to drop 10 degrees. Wrench, standing guard nearby, cracked his knuckles, a sound like dry branches snapping. "Did they follow you?" Jim asked, his voice deadly calm. Toby shook his head. "I don't think so. We ran through the desert." Jim nodded slowly. He reached across the table and placed his massive hand over Toby's small one. "Nobody is ever going to hurt you or your sister again, Toby. You have my word as a Callahan." Just as Jim spoke the words, the roar of an engine echoed from the parking lot. It wasn't the throaty rumble of a Harley. It was the high-pitched whine of a struggling, rusted engine. Toby glanced out the window and froze. His face went chalk white. He dropped his fork, his breathing turning into panicked, ragged gasps. He pointed a shaking finger at the glass. "It's them," Toby whispered, pure terror choking his board. Jim turned his head slowly. Pulling into the diner's parking lot, right past the row of gleaming Harley-Davidsons, was a battered, primer-gray Chevy Silverado. 3 men were inside. Jim Callahan stood up. He didn't look angry. He looked like the angel of death. He turned to Wrench and the rest of his brothers. "Lock the diner doors," Jim ordered quietly. "Nobody gets near this booth." Jim reached to his waist, unbuttoning his heavy leather jacket as he walked purposefully toward the front door. "Let's go welcome the gentleman to Barstow." The midday Mojave sun beat down on the asphalt, creating shimmering waves of heat that distorted the horizon. as Jim Callahan stepped out of the air-conditioned sanctuary of the Crossroads Diner. The wall of oppressive heat hit him like a physical blow. Behind him, the heavy glass door clicked shut, the deadbolt engaging with a sharp, metallic snap courtesy of Arthur "Meat" Sullivan. Jim stood on the diner's concrete porch, his heavy boots planted shoulder-width apart. Flanking him were Wrench, Dutch Miller, and a half-dozen of the San Bernardino Charter's most seasoned enforcers. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. The sheer, overwhelming presence of a united Hells Angels front was usually enough to stop a freight train. The primer gray Chevy Silverado sputtered and died in front of the diner, its radiator hissing a cloud of foul-smelling steam into the dry air. The doors creaked open, and 3 men stepped out. They were a ragtag crew, sweating profusely, their eyes darting nervously across the gleaming row of Harleys before settling on the wall of leather-clad men on the porch. The leader, a wiry man with a face pockmarked from years of hard drug use and the cheap suit jacket worn over a stained undershirt, sneered. His name was Trent, a mid-level enforcer for a Central Valley syndicate that dealt in meth and misery. Flanking him were 2 heavy-set thugs, their hands hovering nervously near their waistbands. Trent took a step forward, trying to project an authority he clearly didn't possess in this parking lot. "Look, we don't want no trouble with the club," Trent called out, his voice cracking slightly under the intense, unblinking stares of the bikers. "We're just here for the 2 strays that wandered in there. Their junkie mother owes our boss a lot of money, and those kids are our insurance policy." Jim didn't move a muscle. He pulled a crushed pack of Marlboros from his jacket pocket, tapped a cigarette against his thumb, and placed it between his lips. Wrench, standing to Jim's right, produced a Zippo and lit it. Jim took a slow, deep drag, the cherry burning bright red, before exhaling a thick plume of gray smoke into the stagnant air. "Diner's closed," Jim rumbled. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a deadly, absolute finality. Trent forced a laugh, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Come on, man. Be reasonable. Those are just a couple of dirty street rats. They mean nothing to you. Hand 'em more, and we'll be on our way. We'll even buy you boys around." Jim took another drag of his cigarette. "I'm going to give you exactly 5 seconds to get back in that rusted piece of junk and drive until the wheels fall off. If you are still standing on this asphalt when I reach 0, you are never leaving this desert." Trent's face hardened, his nervous energy shifting into desperate anger. He didn't know who he was talking to. He only saw an obstacle between him and his payday. "You don't get it, old man," Trent spat, taking another step forward. "Their father, Tommy, stole something from my boss 6 years ago. A ledger. He buried it, and then he took the secret to his grave. But we know he left a safety deposit key with his old lady. She wouldn't talk, so we're taking the kids. Now, step aside, or this gets ugly." The mention of Tommy's name was like a spark hitting a powder keg. Wrench tensed, his hand dropping to the heavy chain at his hip. Dutch shifted his weight, his eyes locking onto the largest of Trent's thugs. But Jim raised a single, calloused hand, halting his brothers. The revelation hung in the air. A key. Tommy hadn't just disappeared. He had struck a blow against the people poisoning his neighborhood, and they had murdered him for it. And now they were coming for his children. Jim flicked his cigarette onto the asphalt and crushed it under the heel of his boot. He looked at Trent, his blue eyes entirely devoid of humanity. He was no longer a grieving brother. He was the president of the Hells Angels. 0, Jim whispered. What happened next was a blur of calculated, overwhelming violence. Trent reached beneath his suit jacket, but before his fingers could even graze the grip of his pistol, Wrench closed the distance. The biker's heavy steel-toed boot connected with Trent's kneecap with a sickening crunch. Trent shrieked, collapsing onto the scorching pavement. Simultaneously, Dutch and another biker named Bones swarmed the 2 thugs. It wasn't a fight. It was an extraction of force. Within seconds, both thugs were disarmed, pinned face down on the boiling asphalt, with heavy biker boots resting comfortably on the backs of their necks. Trent writhed on the ground, clutching his shattered knee, sobbing in pain and sudden, absolute terror. Jim walked slowly down the porch steps, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. He towered over Trent, blocking out the sun. "You killed my brother," Jim stated, the words heavy and cold as iron. It wasn't a question. Trent stared up, his eyes wide with horror as he finally recognized the faded, terrified resemblance between the man standing over him and the man his boss had buried in the Nevada dirt. "Callahan," Trent gasped, spitting blood. You're who? Where is he buried?" Jim asked, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural whisper. Jim knelt, grabbing Trent by the lapels of his cheap suit, hauling him halfway off the ground. "Give me the coordinates, or I will let Wrench take you apart piece by piece, out here where no one can hear you scream." Trembling violently, Trent stammered out the location of a dry riverbed just across the state line. He confessed everything: how Tommy had tried to buy his way out of the life to protect his pregnant girlfriend, how he had stolen the syndicate's financial ledger as leverage, and how the boss had ordered the hit before Tommy could use it. Jim listened, his face an impenetrable mask of stone. When Trent finished, sobbing and begging for his life, Jim dropped him back onto the asphalt in disgust. "Wrench," Jim ordered without looking back. "Strip their truck. Take their phones, their wallets, and their weapons. Leave them the clothes on their backs." Jim leaned down, his face inches from Trent's terrified eyes. "You listen to me, and you listen to me very carefully. You are going to limp back to your boss. You are going to tell him that Tommy Callahan's debt is paid in full. You are going to tell him that if he or anyone associated with him ever comes within 100 miles of those children or their mother, the San Bernardino charter of the Hells Angels will ride north. We will burn his operations to the ground, and we will bury him in the same desert where he left my brother. Do you understand me?" Trent nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, I understand. We're done. We're gone." "Get them out of my sight," Jim growled, turning his back on the broken men. Jim walked back into the silent diner, sliding into the booth across from Toby and Lily. His hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline of the parking lot confrontation faded. He looked at Toby, suddenly recognizing the stubborn jut of Tommy's chin. Then he remembered Trent's words. "A safety deposit key." "Toby," Jim said gently, keeping his voice soft. "Did Dad ever tell you why he wanted you to have that vest?" "Did he hide anything in it?" Toby frowned, looking down at the oversized denim. "Dad sewed it right before he went away. He said the collar was magic. He said if things ever got really, really bad, I had to feel the pad, I had to feel the magic in the collar." Jim's breath caught. He reached out, and Toby hesitantly slipped off the vest, handing it over. Jim ran his calloused fingers along the hand-stitched seam of the collar. Right beneath the faded 81 marker drawing, he felt a hard, small lump the hand-stitched seam of the collar. Right beneath the faded 81 marker drawing. With a pocket knife instantly offered by Wrench, Jim snipped the threads. A small brass safety deposit box key dropped into his wide palm. Stamped into the metal was the number 42. It was the key to the ledger. It was the leverage Tommy had died for, an insurance policy he had hidden in plain sight, wrapped around his son's shoulders to keep him safe. "Is it magic?" Lily piped up, her sweet voice breaking the heavy silence. A single tear escaped Jim's eye, rolling into his thick beard. "Yeah, sweetheart," Jim whispered. "It's magic. It's going to make sure nobody ever hurts you again." Over the next 48 hours, the machinery of the Hells Angels moved with ruthless efficiency. Wrench and Dutch retrieved the ledger from a Los Angeles bank. Armed with a damning record of the cartel's financial ties and bribes, Jim called in favors from allied charters across the West Coast. Without ever involving the police, the syndicate that murdered Tommy Callahan was systematically dismantled and erased from the map. Simultaneously, the club tracked down the children's mother. They found her in a rundown motel, terrified and deep in withdrawal. Instead of violence, they loaded her into a van and drove her straight to a top-tier private rehabilitation clinic in Malibu, paid for entirely by the San Bernardino charter. Meanwhile, Jim arrived at the local courthouse with a team of high-priced corporate lawyers, easily securing emergency custody of Toby and Lily. 2 months later, the San Bernardino clubhouse was unrecognizable. A swing set now sat on the front lawn next to the row of Harleys. The massive, heavily tattooed enforcers who used to spend weekends brawling now spent Saturday mornings teaching Toby how to clean a carburetor or letting Lily paint their fingernails pink. Jim sat on the porch, a cup of black coffee in hand, watching Toby play on the grass. The boy was no longer a starving, terrified street rat. He was healthy, his eyes were bright, and he moved with the absolute confidence of a child who knows he is unconditionally protected. Toby was wearing a new jacket. It was custom-made black leather, tailored perfectly to his small frame. On the back, instead of the Hell's Angel's skull, it bore a simple white rocker, Callahan blood. Wrench stepped onto the porch, wiping grease from his hands. "They're doing good, Jim." Tommy would be proud. For the first time in 6 years, the suffocating weight of his brother's disappearance was gone. Jim had brought Tommy's bones home, and he had saved the only beautiful thing his brother left behind. "Yeah," Jim said quietly, watching his nephew laugh. "They're home." In the harsh reality of the desert, salvation arrived not in a police cruiser, but on 20 roaring motorcycles. Jim Callahan discovered that his brother's legacy wasn't buried in a shallow grave, but hidden in the courage of a starving boy wearing faded denim. Through unimaginable darkness, the unbreakable bond of family was forged anew, proving that sometimes the fiercest protectors wear the darkest leather.